Welcome, everyone. As you begin to kind of leave the waiting room and get into the webinar, we welcome you this afternoon. We'll wait just a second or two more as more folks come in. Good afternoon. My name's Robert Ulley. I will be your moderator. We've got a couple of housekeeping matters for today's AIA California Statewide Advocacy Update. The majority of the content will be delivered by Mark Christensen, who is the Director of Government Relations with AIA California. There is a chat box, a Q&A box. Please feel free to submit your questions in that box and we will address them if time allows going along, or we'll bunch them all up at the end. At the end, if you raise your hand, you can ask your question live. Rebecca will unmute you at that point and we can have a conversation of your questions live. You will receive an LU credit for your continuing education. AIA California staff will take care of that for you at the end of this presentation. And of course, as normal, this presentation is being recorded so that you can reference it at any time later on demand. Next slide, Rebecca, thank you. So today we have Mark Christensen, who's Honorary AIA California Director of Government Relations, to take us through AIA California advocacy and a couple issues. Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you everyone for attending. As Robert said, Mark Christian, I am Director of Government Relations with AIA California, position I've held for a little bit over 20 years. And I just want to talk with you about the advocacy program, why it exists, and then we'll get into some specifics, but why the advocacy program exists. And we do reactive legislation, responding to legislation introduced at the request of others. We sponsor our own legislation. We come up with ideas on how to do that. We work on appointments in those positions in state government where an architect needs to be appointed. I don't have the other one up here, which I should have, regulations. We also get involved in the regulatory process. Next slide, please. So advocacy is one of the primary programs within AIA California. And so why is advocacy important? You know, I like to point out that AIA California moved from San Francisco to Sacramento in 1981. Jokingly, I say it wasn't because of the weather, it wasn't because of the skyline or the river over the Delta. It was for a different reason. Next slide, please. And that is because the state capital is located in Sacramento. This is where laws are enacted, legislation's debated, laws are enacted. Next slide, please. The legislation that can impact the profession, that can impact the business of architecture, the practice of architecture, the risks of architecture. Next slide, please. For example, you as licensed architects exist because state law says you can. State law says that individuals with the 3 E's, education, experience, examination, or a combination, can sit for the examinations and can become a licensed architect. State law says what you can do. State law says how you can organize. State law says what your risk and liability is. State law creates you, allows you to exist, I should say, and imposes many of the conditions that affect your ability to provide design services, that affects your ability to operate a business, that affects your ability to manage the risk. All of that is in state law. Next slide, please. Some examples of these would be a turf battles, if I may just put it that way. The Architects Practice Act has the scope of practice for architecture. It says this is what architects can do. Only architects can do this work. There are always different interest groups out there that are trying to get a piece of that turf, if I may put it that way. Whether it is, what can engineers do? What can non-licensed people do? I am not a licensed architect. I can legally design houses. State law says, the Architects Practice Act says a non-licensed person can design a residence. A non-licensed person can design interior spaces that are non-structural, non-seismic, and do not affect the safety of the building. And there's always an effort, not always, but there's it's not uncommon for there to be an effort for the non-licensed people, non-licensed architects, to expand the work that they can do. So we watch that. Next, please. The liability issues, legal issues, protecting your rights. These are all things that can come up in the legislature. Things that we've worked on in the past is that we have amended the law that says an architect can be responsible, an architect is responsible for changes made to plans only if the architect authorized those changes in writing. So if something is built, constructed in a way different than the approved set of plans, if the architect did not authorize those changes in writing, the law says the architect is not responsible for any damages that results from those changes. We also did legislation that clearly specifies that the architect's instruments of service can be used only with the written permission of the architect. Now, that is pretty much existing law, but we put it in very simple language involving a situation where an architect may provide services to a client, gets the building permit, and the client decides to sell the land to someone else, and they sell it with, hey, I have a set of documents, I have a building permit, you're ready to go. The architect did not have a relationship with the new owner. The new owner does not have the right to use those documents from the architect without the written permission of the architect. And so we modified the law to put that in plain English to help architects protect their rights. Indemnity, an issue that pretty much every firm owner knows and understands. Basically, whenever anyone, not just an architect, but anyone signs a contract that includes the word indemnity, that person is promising to become an insurance company for legal services for the other party. So if you indemnify a person, you may have to provide insurance or legal protection for the other person, even though the errors and omissions insurance that architects have does not cover that level of protection. We have been involved on this issue for many years. I see that there is someone in attendance, Newell Arnerich, the mayor of Danville, I believe it is this year, Newell, who has helped us back in the 2000s, before 2010, I think right around 2008, to amend the law to basically say that an architect is not responsible until there's a finding that the architect's at fault. I am told that this level of protection does not continue to exist as court rulings have affected it, but we have tried twice in the past. We've successfully amended the law twice in the past to better protect architects, and there may be a need to do it again in the future. Next slide, please. We also work on issues that allow that spells out what type of project delivery methods, design and construction services, how these services can be provided to public entities. Many know that for many years it was design, bid, build was the project delivery method for public projects. Beginning around 2000, design build was added to the law for school districts, and now pretty much any public entity can use design build. And there are still efforts to expand the type of project delivery methods that can be used. CM at risk, progressive design build is the new movement. Law last year allows the state Department of General Services to use it on 3 projects. There's legislation going through right now that would allow public entities to use design build, mostly for engineering type work, but it is growing. And so we follow that. We will get involved in those efforts. And that's another example of how state law can impact the architectural profession. Next slide, please. One of the specific issues that seems to come up every once in a while is the sales tax on services. If there is one area of the economy that's not yet taxed, it's services with a sales tax. As you know, a sales tax is imposed on products, tangible goods, but there, in California at least, there's no sales tax on services. There are efforts that come up every once in a while to expand the sales tax to services, including architectural services. There was what we thought to be a pretty big threat a few years ago. A significant legislator was introducing legislation 3-4 years in a row to expand the sales tax on services. As a result, AIA California joined several other groups, accountants, attorneys, bankers, real estate agents, other professional groups, including business groups like the Chamber of Commerce. And we formed a coalition, and AIA California is a founding member of the coalition, to argue against a sales tax on services. We did an economic analysis of it. We developed arguments against it through this coalition. And while the threat is not strong right now, because California has about a $100 billion surplus, when you have a $100 billion surplus, it's not a good time to propose a new tax. We have this coalition is still together, knowing that soon there will be not a $100 billion surplus, but a $40, $50, $60 billion deficit. And when that deficit hits, the talk to create new tax revenue, such as a sales tax on services, will become front and center again. The reality is, in California, it is easier to enact new taxes than it is to cut spending. That's just the politics of California. So while this group is not that active right now, it remains together. We know that once the economy turns and once we have massive budget deficits, talk of a sales tax on services will continue. Next slide. So I mentioned that we do sponsor legislation. I gave some examples in the past saying that an architect is responsible to changes made to the documents only if the architect authorized them in writing. And I mentioned that protecting the instruments of service, that no one can use an architect's instruments of services unless it is authorized in writing. Those are examples of sponsored legislation we've done in the past. A couple other ones, the more recent ones. Last year, we sponsored AB 1010 that is intended to position architects to be prepared in California and arguably leaders in the nation on zero net carbon design by requiring architects to take continuing education in zero net carbon design. This will go into effect with the 2023 renewal cycle next year, and it's 5 hours every 2 years. We also had language inserted into AB 830. This affected people, the issue affected people who were trying to start new firms. For some reason, out of the blue, the Secretary of State's office started rejecting firm names. If a firm was going to organize as a general corporation and they wanted to use a last name and the word architect in there, Smith Jones Architect, they were not allowed to do that. They had to organize as a professional corporation. There was no statutory authority for this, in our opinion. So we ran language in a bill successfully that restores the firm naming freedom to those who wish to organize as a general corporation and to use their last name and the word architect in their firm name. This year, we're sponsoring SB 1214. This deals with what information a planning department can make available to the public. Right now, many planning departments will post the architect's submittal to the planning departments online as a part of the process to keep the public informed, to keep their constituencies informed so they can make informed comments on proposed projects. The problem is a lot of the information in those documents submitted to planning departments are protected under the Federal Copyright Act. And by posting them on the website, that alone is a violation of the Copyright Act. And they're facilitating people to download them and copy them, which is another violation of the Copyright Act. So we have this legislation 1214 that will limit how planning departments can make information available to the public. We are saying that massing diagrams and site plans, that information can be posted online. The full submittals to the planning departments can be viewed only in person and without they have to be monitored so that they're not copying it with a smartphone, taking a picture of it, what have you. This is very similar, not exact, but similar to the law that regulates how building departments can make plans available to the public. The public can come in and view them, but they can't get a copy of them without the permission of the architect or the owner of the property. Next slide. The thing I forgot to put in there is regulations. We also get involved in the regulatory process, wherever that may be. For example, on building codes, with the excellent help of Michael Malinowski, FAIA, an architect here in Sacramento and a former president of AIA California. He is very much engaged in the building codes process, and he under the name of AIA California has proposed a couple of changes to the building codes. One of them is to advance the zero emissions or zero carbon aspects into the building code, electrification, what have you. There's a Architecture 2030 has a zero code. We are asking that become a part of the green building code. That probably is not going to happen, but there may be aspects of it that may be a part of the building code. We are advancing the conversation on that through Mike's leadership and Mike's efforts. Also, we are asking that the additional chapters of the international existing building code, that's the model code, the performance chapters be included into the California existing building code. Right now, the California existing building code only includes those chapters that are prescriptive in nature, not performance. As California is trying to become more creative in addressing the housing crisis, as the governor is wanting to look at adapting or converting underutilized commercial buildings into housing, the additional chapters of the existing building code will give architects and their clients and developers additional tools to make that happen. So we are pushing that. Another example that some of you may be aware of is the California Architects Board was considering, still is considering regulations regarding the advertising of architectural services or architects advertising. The regulation would have required that anytime an architect offers services or advertises, the architect would have to include their license number in that advertising. Right now, the Architects Practice Act, of course, requires any contract with a client to include the architect's license number. This would have gone beyond that. It would have required if a mother of a high school athlete who wants to help the program by advertising, her firm in the school's athletic brochure would have to include a license number. It could have had far-ranging effects that we just don't know yet. And the whole intent of that was to help the Architects Board go after and stop non-licensed people illegally advertising architectural services. And the thought was if they ever see an advertisement with a license number, they can easily verify that that person is an architect and they don't have to investigate that. There was a lot of concern raised from architects, probably more comments on this to the Architects Board than any other issue the Architects Board considered, expressing concern about the cost of it, having to reprint all of the business cards, reprint all of the letterhead, have someone update the website, that The architect would be the one fined if there was a violation, could be fined, I should say, if there's a violation, even though this is targeting non-licensed people, that it would be the architect who would be in trouble for violating these new regulations. So as a result, from many comments expressed from architects to the California Architects Board, they have put those regulations on hold, and they'll consider them, looking at them again, perhaps from scratch later on this year. I mentioned earlier that we work on appointments. There are several positions in state government that by law requires the person appointed to that position by the governor has to be a licensed architect, such as the state architect, the 5 architect members of the California Architects Board, the architect member of the California Building Standards Commission, and the 6 architects who hold the architect positions on the 6 code advisory committees to the California Building Standards Commission. The Seismic Safety Commission has a spot reserved for an architect. The HCAI, I forget what that stands for, formerly OSHPD, the regulatory entity over health facilities, they have a hospital building safety board that has an architect. And the law on that one's interesting. They cannot appoint someone unless that person is nominated by AIA California. That's stated in state law. So we work with the governor's office, or we work with the regulatory entity, such as the Building Standards Commission for the Code Advisory Committees, or the new OSHPD for the Hospital Safety Board, on identifying qualified AIA members to serve in those positions. And I think more often than not, we are successful in doing that. I think I've ran through this program pretty quickly, and we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions about what is happening this year, questions on the advocacy program. What role do members have in this? For example, this is not a staff-driven organization. Staff here, we do not set policy, we implement policy. I mentioned that we get involved in reactive legislation. We have a process for that. We have 3 committees, the Advocacy Advisory Committee, the Climate Action Committee, the Urban Design Committee, that will review legislation that has been introduced. There's about 2,000 bills introduced every year. I will go through in one way or another, to some degree or another, every single bill that's introduced, every bill that's amended, and identify bills that may be of interest to the profession. And then I will send those to one of those committees, and those committees comprising AIA members will look at it and make recommendations to the board of directors. Hey, this is a good bill, we should support it. This bill is terrible, we should oppose it. This bill could be good if it were amended to do this. And it is your colleagues who make up the board of directors. Our board of directors comprises representatives from each of the chapters that sets the policy. They are the ones that vote on and adopt AIA California positions on legislation. We, for sponsored legislation, every year we send a survey to the membership, basically saying, should we have it? Does a change in law need to happen? Is there any law that impacts your ability to provide services to your clients? Is there something that California is not doing well enough that it should be doing? What is that idea? And we will generate ideas from that survey. There was a bill back in the 2000s that clarified for school districts that state law does not give them ownership of the intellectual property of school plans. They thought they owned the plans, can reuse them however they wanted, because state law says the plans are the property of the school district. Well, that means the physical plans they own. It did not mean that they owned the intellectual property rights. So we clarified that with school districts to help architects protect their rights, their copyrights, and manage their risk if their plans were ever reused on another project without their authorization, without their involvement. And we also amended the law to say that if a school district retains the right to reuse plans and it chooses to reuse the plans without using the original architect, the school district has to indemnify and hold harmless the original architect on anything that goes wrong with the reuse of those plans. I'm going to open it up to questions. If you have any questions, raise your hand.
Thank you, Mark. There was a question posted in the chat about the 2022 legislative calendar for AIA California and whether or not that is a document that could be sent out to the members.
I see. Is this one where it says the AIA California positions on the legislation?
Yes.
Yes, there is a list. We will put it in next week's relevance. Relevance
Awesome.
goes out on Wednesday. We'll make sure that updated list and the status of those bills is included in relevance. Thank you, Will.
And then that will include whether we oppose, support, or look for an alternate way. Excellent.
Absolutely.
In the Q&A, there was a question about 1090, new regulations on the horizon for Fair Political Act. Got anything to say about that?
This is a sore spot with me. 1090 is the conflict of interest body of law, Government Code 1090 and several other sections. And the original intent of the 1090 body of law, conflict of interest law, was that to stop those who are in the position to make decisions, city council people, from voting on a contract in which they will financially benefit. So a city council member cannot vote on a contract with his firm, or she cannot vote on a contract that benefits her husband. Her husband's an owner of the business. That a person who has the ability to make decisions cannot vote on an issue in which they have a financial benefit. So that's a conflict of interest, and that was the original purpose of the 1090 body of law. It has since grown, and courts have determined that it's not meant to stop just actual conflicts of interest. It's meant to stop the appearance of a conflict of interest. Even if there is no financial gain, if there is an appearance of a conflict of interest, that is deemed to be a 1090 violation. And you don't want to get a 1090 violation. The Fair Political Practices Commission can come down with fines. They can take any profits that were made. The state is very serious about not allowing financial gains from a conflict of interest or the appearance of a conflict of interest. So how does this affect architects? When an architect is not, say an architect is merely a principal of a firm signing a contract with a public entity, the architect is not voting on any contract. The architect is signing a contract to provide services. Well, let's say you are signing a contract to do a site analysis for a school district. You want to analyze different properties, different sites, what can be done, what are the options to help them manage the projected growth in student enrollment. So you do these planning documents. Now the school district decides to build some new schools based upon your analysis. That very well could be, if you take this second contract, if you take the follow-on contract, that very well could be a conflict of interest, because you have helped create, as a consultant, the need for new projects. And by taking those new projects, you are now financially gaining, you're financially benefiting from your consulting work during the planning stages. There was legislation 3-4 years ago that would have addressed this, that would have fixed it. And this is what it becomes a little bit of a sore point for me. That would have said that this conflict of interest does not exist for architects and engineers if they're doing, pre-design work. That would not stop them from doing the design work on any projects that come from it. This bill was sponsored by our engineering friends, ACEC California and AIA California. ACEC was the lead sponsor on it. They got the legislator. They were the lead sponsor. The subcontracting groups came out in opposition to it. Their main concern was construction management. Their main concern was that if you have the design professional doing the design work and the design professional also serving as construction manager, if there were ever any issues during construction, they thought the deck was stacked against them. That the design professional and the construction manager, same entity, is saying, no, this is a contractor issue. This is a subcontractor issue. This change order is denied. The documents are very clear. Well, these subcontractors thought that this was not fair. This is not right. They wanted to exclude construction management from this exemption to the 1090 conflict of interest body of law. To us, it was quite reasonable. They had a legitimate argument, legitimate point. It was easy for us to agree to that because architects really don't offer construction management as one of the services. Yes, architects are involved with construction management firms, but Acme Architects generally does not do construction management. We could not find any of our firms that do construction management, especially on their projects, because it's kind of is a conflict. So we agreed to that. Unfortunately, ACEC has some big members. They're an association of firms, unlike AIA, an association of individuals. ACEC has some large firms where that is their business model, part of the business model, to provide construction management services on their projects. So they resisted the suggested change, the demanded change by the subcontractors, said, no, we're not going to take that, we'll fight you. Well, the subcontractors got their union friends involved, and it became very, very political. So if it's architects and engineers versus contractors, subcontractors, and their unions in California, we don't win. That was obvious to me. That was apparent to me. We're saying, take it. If we can get 97% of what we're asking for, that's good. Let's not hold off for 100% when 100% actually is unattainable, unachievable. Our engineering friends made that decision to take the language too late. The war had already been declared. The shots had already been fired. You could not stop it. So the author dropped the bill and the bill died. So we were not able to fix that. I understand that FPPC, the Fair Political Practices Commission, has put out some documents. I think that I'm told that help define that line, that if an architect in the pre-design services crosses the line, they may be ineligible for the design services. And additionally, the FPPC can answer on a project, on a specific case, a case-by-case basis, help the public entity understand, are they crossing that line? If they have an architect do the pre-design services as it is defined, are they eligible to do design services? And we certainly recommend architects ask their public sector clients if this project, if they will be eligible to do the design services. But I think we could have had a fix. We should have had a fix, but our partners did not make the same decision we would have made. And so we didn't get the legislative fix. I don't know if that answers the question asked.
We do have quite a few questions. So the next one is, what's the general temperature on interior licensing of interior designers?
Well, right now there is no legislation to create a practice act for interior design. And architects have a practice act, engineers have a practice act, doctors, accountants, they have practice acts. A practice act is, this is the scope of practice and you have to be licensed to engage in it, which is good. And it's intended to protect public health, safety, welfare. You don't want someone who is not a licensed doctor to perform surgeries. You don't want someone who is not an architect to design a building. Interior designers right now do not have a practice act. They have an exemption in the Architects Practice Act that says interior spaces can be done by an unlicensed person so long as the work is non-structural, non-seismic, and does not affect the safety of the building. In my time here, there have been 3 efforts to create a practice act for interior design. The first one made it to the governor. It was vetoed. This is around 2000, 2001. The second one, I believe, failed in the House of Origin. It was an assembly bill, I believe, and it died in the state assembly, or it may have been a Senate bill, died in the state Senate. The third one was never brought up for a vote because it didn't have the votes to get out of committee, even though the author of the bill was a member of that committee, which says something. I would love to say that this failed because AIA California's fantastic advocacy against it. The reason why it failed is that there was a civil war. I mean, we certainly help, but there's a civil war in the interior design community. They're fighting each other. And when the last two times they tried to do the Practice Act, you had half of the interior design community, those from community colleges, showing up to the legislative hearings and saying, this bill will stop us from doing what we can do right now. You had the League of California Community Colleges saying, we might as well close down our programs because if this becomes law, the people we're educating will not be able to work. And that's pretty much what killed it. And they have not tried since. There is a certification program for interior designers that was formed in 1991. The authorizing legislation, I believe, was 1991. And this was a compromise with an effort to create a practice act for interior designers. And what it said is that interior designers operating under the exemption in the Architects Practice Act could become certified and can get a stamp. So a stamp issued by a private nonprofit entity authorized by the state. If the people had the 3 E's, education, experience, and examination, and they could get a stamp and they can use the stamp and they can call themselves a certified interior designer. It did not stop a non-certified interior designer from doing the exact same work, but it helped certified interior designers demonstrate a level of competency for the clients, for the building officials, what have you. This program comes up for sunset review every 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it is. And this year is up for sunset review, the certification. The interior designers are asking to, as we would describe it, expand the type of work they can do. They would say it is clarifying the work that they can do. And I imagine this up to debate, everyone's gonna have their own personal opinion, but they would like to add into the law specific elements that they can include in their documents to building officials. Rated corridors, horizontal exiting, for example, and I think reflected ceiling plans. They have tried this in the past. It has failed in the past. Our argument is those are all features that affect the safety of the building. And the exemption in the Architects Practice Act, under which interior designers operate, has the non-structural, non-seismic, does not affect the safety of the building requirement. And rated corridors and horizontal exiting certainly are safety of the building items. That decision has not been made yet. We have about 1 month left in the legislature, the month of August. The legislature is on a month-long summer break right now. The bill to extend the sunset date is right now it's pretty simple. It extends the sunset date. AIA California supports that. We believe there's value in the certified interior design program. We have historically and so far to date, we are opposing the expanding of what they can do as we would argue it. And the decision will be made in August or maybe made this month, whether that language is included in the bill or not. The decision, as I'm told from legislative staff, has not been made yet. But right now, there's no Practice Act legislation. I'm not aware of any plans to do it. I know that there are interior design groups, IIDA, ASID, that would like to do it, but they faced difficulty the last 2 times they tried, and I think they want to be very deliberate and very logical in their next steps. And they also have to look at how CCIDC, the California Council for Interior Design Certification, the certified interior designers, the existence of that program, how that impacts their ability to get a Practice Act.
There were 2 questions there, somewhat related. First, shout out to our esteemed president of AIA California, Rona Rothenberg, FAIA. Hi, Rona. There were 2 questions related to how members can get more involved. One was what committees, and there are a number of committees related to advocacy that have members. And if you're interested in those, email us and we'll get you some specific information. The second one was related to that, and that is, do you have to have any special knowledge or any training to be on these committees? And I would say no. The fact that you're a licensed practitioner gives you sufficient knowledge to navigate. You don't need to be a policy writer. We're not drafting policy. Mark and his colleagues and staff help navigate that part of the process. We're looking out for how it affects the profession, good, bad, or indifferent. There was another question about DIR and what kind of progress we're making on DIR.
It's a good question. It's another one that is frustrating to me. The Department of Industrial Relations, this is the entity that enforces the prevailing wage laws. A while back, and for those who don't know prevailing wage, if it's a public works project, this is a very simple explanation. If it's a public works project, any work on the ground has to be paid a minimum prevailing wage. The state establishes that wage. It's generally higher than the industry standard at the private level. It's basically union wages. And this exists to, I think, ensure that union shops can compete for the work, that they will not be underbid by non-union shops that may be completely underpaying their employees. So prevailing wage does provide a livable wage for those involved in construction on public works projects, and it levels the playing field so that union shops can compete with non-union shops for public works. The cost to oversee the enforcement of the prevailing wage laws, because I mean, it's probably not hard to imagine, there are probably some contractors out there that try to cheat the system. Yeah, we'll pay it, and they don't. And there's a whole regulatory process, payroll process, reporting to ensure that there are no cheats out there, but I'm sure it happens. So they have a very diligent process to oversee and enforce the prevailing wage laws. The cost of that, until about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was paid for by the public entities. So when ABC school district was going to do a school, ABC school district had to pay a fee to DIR to cover the cost. Well, a while back that was changed. It was changed to say that contractors had to pay the cost for DIR to oversee it. And that was paid through a registration program. They became registered public works contractors. And in May, I don't know what the initial fee was. I believe now it's $400 a year or $300. I think it may be $400 a year now. That if anyone wants to compete for public works, they have to be a public works contractor, a registered public works contractor. And that money is what pays for the oversight of the prevailing wage laws, the enforcement of the prevailing wage laws. I should see the oversight of it, the compliance with those laws. There was a budget bill 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, whatever it was, that included some pretty innocuous language that, as it turns out, basically requires anyone involved in public works, regardless of whether the services they provide include a requirement to pay a prevailing wage, to have to register as a public works contractor. So architects who are only going to be doing in design, let's say DGS is going to do an interior design, a TI project on a building here in Sacramento for expanded state workers. It's just TI only. There's nothing in the architect's contract that involves a prevailing wage. No land surveying, no geotechnical, if that's under the architect's contract, nothing. It's all just design, no prevailing wage. That architect will still have to register as a public works contractor in order to get the work. That architect would have to register as a public works contractor in order to compete for the work. Every architect that wants to compete for the work would have to register as a public works contractor at $400 a year. We have raised this issue with DIR, saying this does not make sense, this is not fair. We have talked with the building trades saying this does not make sense if the architect is, if services under the architect's contract does not involve a service that requires the payment of the prevailing wage. Why are architects having to register? We are well aware that we cannot change the law without the blessings of the trades. It's just the politics in California. Unsurprisingly, we found them to be very, very reluctant to engage in the conversation. Unsurprisingly, we found DIR to be very reluctant to identify this as a problem that needs to be fixed. We did have legislation introduced in 2020. We thought, what the heck, let's give it, let's do this, let's have the fight. You know, if we lose, we lose, but let's try. Then COVID happened and the legislature came to a halt. And this is something like 75% of the bills were dropped, never brought up for hearing. Our bill was one of the bills that was dropped. We have not pursued it since. We've talked with legislators. Many of them just don't want to take on a fight with the trades. There's just a fear of a fight, and they don't want to get on the bad side of the trades. The trades are major players, political players in Sacramento. It's something that is unresolved that still needs to be fixed. We look at it every year. We still want to do it. We think this is, we all hear, as we just had July 4th, taxation without representation. This is fees without justification. This is taking fees for services that are not going to be provided. Yes, we understand why DIR doesn't care. It's money for nothing. Yes, we understand why the trades don't care. Hey, it's benefiting them. You know, you're all rich architects, you can pay it. I know that's not the case, but it benefits them. They have no desire to see a change. But at some point, we have to do a fight again. Just put it up there and force them to justify it. In one of my conversations with DIR, they try to tell me that it's not just about prevailing wage, it's about all the labor laws that they enforce. And I said, can you give me, a list? Can you let me know of these fees that you collect, what percentage of the fees goes to prevailing wage oversight and what goes to other labor laws? Of course, they never responded. And if you go to the website and the FAQs about the registered public works contractor, they don't mention any of the other labor laws. They only talk about prevailing wage enforcement. It's one of those big issues that's unresolved.
Thank you. Next question, what's your opinion, what kind of effort would be involved to require that all building design be by licensed architects?
That would be very, very difficult. Let me just talk about it's Business Profession Code 5537. This is the exemption in the Architects Practice Act that says a non-licensed person can design a residence, so long as it's no more than 2 stories in a basement, standard wood frame construction, and no more than, it's either 3 or 4 units. I forget off the top of my head. But it's basically, I, a political dweeb, I can legally design a house and submit the documents to the building department. Chances are the building department is going to want a structural engineer to do the calcs and to stamp it, but I legally can do that. The state law does not prohibit me from doing that. There are folks who do that. Some of these people went to architecture school and never got a license. They design houses. If we were to try to close 5537 and stop people who are currently doing this, stop them from continuing to do it, we would have to have empirical data showing that stopping these people from continuing to do the work they do is a threat to the consumer, that the consumer is harmed by non-licensed people designing residences. We have to have empirical data to show that that harm exists. If we don't have data showing that the harm exists, I don't think we would get legislation introduced. And if we were able to get legislation introduced, I don't think it would get a single vote, because it would be seen as a turf fight. It would be seen as architects trying to take work away from others. Now, if we had data showing that non-licensed individuals are putting the health, safety, and welfare of residents, occupants of the building, or users of the building in danger, at risk, then I think we have a very good shot at doing that. For about 20 years, I've been looking every once in a while for any empirical data on that. I cannot find it. If anyone has, knows where one can find solid empirical data on it, then that's something that AIA California can pursue. Absent that data, I think it's just a very, very difficult, by very difficult, I mean pretty much impossible task to get anything through the legislature. And if we tried, it would probably make the AIA and the architectural profession look bad, which is something we attempt to avoid at great cost, without concern for cost.
Thank you. Are we advocating all electric buildings in California?
We are supporting efforts to change the codes to do that. The California Energy Commission probably is not going to do it as fast as AI California and other allies have asked, but it probably will happen at some point in the future. AI California is supporting, with the blessings of the relevant local chapter, the adoption of local electrification codes. I think there are nearly 50 jurisdictions in California, cities, counties that have done so. And again, AI California will support those efforts if the local chapter says we can support them. If the local chapter says no, we will not support those.
Here seems like a very relevant question. Question was asked about a building department requiring a stamp set for an ADU garage conversion. That seems like a misstep on the building department's part, since it's a residential unit, but maybe the person posing the question can elaborate a little bit. Might want to raise your hand and just speak it out. While we're waiting for that, next one is, what's the difference between so-called non-architect designers who do high-rise buildings?
Do they still exist? I know the building designers, the profession of building designers existed in the past, but then there was an effort to close, a successful effort to close that classification in state law, and it was done so by grandfathering them into the Architects Practice Act, or allowing them to become licensed architects. Are there, I'm not aware if there are people who still non-licensed architects who are, they may be engineers. I think engineers can get away with it at times. Are there non-licensed individuals designing high-rise buildings? I'm not aware of that. And if the person who asked the question, I see that Arturo has his hand raised. I don't know if that's for this issue or if that's for, it may be Arturo. Rebecca, can you unmute Arturo? I think he may be on this question.
Go ahead, Arturo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
go
can.
ahead.
Oh, okay, great. So, yeah, here in San Diego, there are non-licensed architects that I don't believe are part of the building divisions that are around my same age that are designing 14 and 15-story buildings.
Can you send, Arturo, can you send that information to us? I believe that is not allowed in state law. Send me that information and we'll look into it.
Yeah, that's one. And the second one being, I have two particular clients that a non-licensed so-called identified himself as an architect, but I looked for his license, he's not. One client, he wound up charging him 40 grand for renovation to a 3-story loft building, historical, and provided no services. And the same individual wound up doing another project for someone else where he submitted a project that had no relevance to what the actual project was and cost him, I think it was $12,000, and walked away. So in total, I mean, from the two projects of this individual was close to $60,000 with nothing in hand. So what I'm, trying to figure out is, what am I doing here? I'm a licensed architect. I paid my dues. I've been in this a long time. I worked on the construction side before. I'm doing what needs to be done right for not only the profession, but for myself. And I see these guys that are non-licensed getting these major buildings, and these other people that are non-licensed that are giving us a bad name because they're going around saying they're architects. And then at the end of the day, we can't compete with people who aren't non-licensed because they're not assuming the liabilities. They can walk away from a condo project and say, well, I'm not licensed. I have no importance here. So, the people that are getting screwed are us. That's pretty much where I'm going with this. So
if you ever come across a non-licensed person advertising their services as architects, you can let us know, or you can let the California Architects Board know. The California Architects Board staff is very good about researching it and contacting the person, letting them know that they are violating the law. And if they continue to violate it, the Architects Board can impose a fine on them. Getting them to pay it is something different, but the Architects Board will do excellent work in contacting them, informing them, and if necessary, imposing a fine on them, which at a minimum should scare them. But I put in the chat, I put my email address. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I think it's also important to point out that you should notify the local jurisdictions about this person, because if they're getting permits or they're purporting to be licensed architects or doing the scope of work of a licensed architect, local jurisdictions should also know.
I see that we have chat and Q&A. I see that there's a question, the National Building Performance Standards Coalition, which pledged line emissions reductions. I don't know if that.
We also have about 3 minutes.
So that first question, beyond my ability to answer, I apologize. Another one's at OSHPOT or HCAI, understaffed in the field. We certainly can try to work with HCIA. I know that we have some members in leadership, such as Mark Paone, who does health facilities and has a very close relationship with them. And also the Hospital Safety Board. There's an architect on there. We certainly can ask if there's anything that we can work with them on, if there's any needed changes to law to streamline the process. Absolutely, and HCI can, we can talk to Mark Paone about that. Design build projects, the owner hires a GC. As I understand it, we're under design build, the owner hires the GC and the GC hires the architect, like as a subcontractor, the same as any subcontractor. As I understand it, that is pretty much what design build is. For a variety of reasons, the GC is the lead on design build. There is design-led design build, but for a variety of reasons, such as bonding capacity and what have you, I'm told that it is contractor. If there is any chance to require architect-led design build, I think that might be difficult, but it certainly is not prohibited. The existing law does allow it. Did we surrender the